Hey guys, Shock Therapy here, and we're here to show you how to install a dual rate spring kit on an 18 and newer Turbo S with Dynamix shocks. This dual rate spring kit is going to do a couple things for you. Number one, give you a much taller ride height than factory. Two, get rid of some of the bucking and kicking that's prevalent in the factory spring kit. Three, a much more plush ride quality. Not only are all of our springs made in the USA and carrying a lifetime warranty, but they will only take a set one time. After the first 100 to 200 miles, readjust your ride height and it will maintain it for the life of the spring. This is a relatively easy installation, should only take you 2 to 3 hours. So let's take a break and watch Mitch show us how to put it on.
What's up guys, it's Mitch, and today we're back at it again for another install video for you. Today we're going to be doing the spring kit install on the 2018 to 2021 Polaris Turbo S Dynamix.
First step is to jack the car up in the front until the tires are just off the ground. Always use jack stands for safety. Next, remove the driver's side shock, starting with the lower hardware first. Don't forget to unplug the factory shock loom. Remove one shock at a time as they are side specific and you do not want to mix them up from left to right. With the shock and the spring compressor, lower the bump stop down the shock shaft enough to remove the lower spring perch. Remove the factory springs, but remember to save the factory spring divider. With the shock in the vise, you can now set the preload as well as the crossover ring heights. Preload collar should be set at 3.5 inches. This is measured from the bottom of the shock top to the bottom of the preload collars.
3.5. Take the 2-piece ones, flat to flat.
Next, install the crossover rings. The crossover rings have a recessed groove on one side and a flat surface on the other. Make sure that they're threaded onto the shock with the flat surface touching each other and the recessed grooves facing the top and bottom of the shock. Set the crossover ring height to 5.5 inches, measuring from the shock top to the bottom of the crossover rings. With the distances set, you can now lock the crossover rings as well as the preload collars. Install the silent O-ring once everything is locked in place. With the shock and the spring compressor, you can now install the spring kit. Start with the upper spring first, making sure that the logo and part number is right side up. Now install the factory spring divider with the long end facing the shock shaft. Install the lower spring and check that they are clocked. This means that the end of the bottom spring and the end of the top spring are touching the spring divider on opposite sides. Compress the system and install the lower spring perch. Now you can install the shock back on the vehicle. Start with the upper hardware first. When installing the shock hardware, make sure that you leave it loose. We will check the ride heights later on in the installation, and it is easier to tighten the hardware after ride heights are set. Do not forget to plug the factory shock loom back into the shock. Repeat these steps on the opposite front shock.
Two-piece, flat to flat.
With both front shocks installed on the vehicle and the hardware left loose, remove the jack stands and lower the car. Next, jack the rear of the car up until the tires are just off the ground, using jack stands for safety. Remove the driver's side shock first, as they are side-specific just like the front. Do not mix up the shocks from left to right. Unplug the factory shock wiring harness. Remove the shock from the vehicle and install in the spring compressor. Lower the factory bump stop down the shock shaft to allow you to remove the lower spring perch. Remove the spring perch and the factory springs, saving the factory spring divider. With the shock in the vise, you can now set the preload and crossover ring heights. Set the rear preload collar to 3.5 inches, measuring from the bottom of the shock top to the bottom of the preload collar. Install the rear 2-piece crossover rings at 7 inches, making sure that the flat side is facing the top of the shock and the recessed groove is facing the shock shaft. Tighten the crossover ring hardware equally. Install the silent crossover O-ring. With the shock and the spring compressor, you can now install the upper spring, making sure that the logo and part number are right side up, keeping in mind that the shock is upside down. Install the factory spring divider with the long end facing the shock shaft. Install the lower spring, making sure that they are clocked accordingly with the ends of the springs touching the divider on opposite sides. Compress the system and install the lower spring perch. Now install the shock back on the vehicle, starting with the upper hardware first. Make sure that the hardware is left loose. Do not forget to plug in the factory shock harness, making sure that it clicks all the way in. Repeat these steps on the opposite rear side. On the passenger side shock, remove the breather tube for the intake system. Install the shock on the passenger side. With the hardware left loose and the loom plugged back in, do not forget to reinstall the intake system or the engine will be choked down and not run properly. Removing jack stands, you can now put the rear of the car back on the ground. It's now time to settle the suspension and check ride heights. All ride heights should be checked with the driver in the vehicle. Also, to settle the suspension, you must drive around the block or at least back and forth, hitting the brakes and the accelerator multiple times. When you come to a stop at the end, make sure you do that gradually without hitting the brakes. Check front ride height by measuring the rear lower control arm mount at the bottom of the chassis to the ground. This ride height should be 16 inches with the driver in the car. Check the rear ride height at the very center of the chassis all the way at the back to the ground. This should be 15.5 inches to the bottom of the chassis. The reason that the bolts were left loose on all of the shocks is so that you could adjust ride height if necessary. If your car is lower or higher than the measurements we require, you need to change the preload accordingly. The front of the shock is a 2-to-1 ratio. Moving the preload collar 1/2 inch will raise or lower the car by 1 inch. The rear preload collars are a 1-to-1 ratio. Moving them 1 inch will raise or lower the car 1 inch. Adjust the car properly, take your time, make it right. It does affect the ride quality if you don't do this step. With all the ride heights set, you can now measure the crossover ring heights. Front crossover measurement should be about 1 inch between the bottom of the crossover and the top of the spring divider. Rear crossover height should be 2 to 2.5 inches distance between the spring divider and the bottom of the crossover ring. With crossovers set and ride heights accurate, you can now tighten all the hardware for all the shocks. When you're tightening the hardware, make sure that all of the wire looms are plugged into every shock. With the hardware tightened, the looms plugged back in, the intake tube reinstalled, your installation is now done.
Mitch, thank you for showing us how to install those springs, and hopefully your installation went just as easy as Mitch made it look. There's a few things to remember when it comes to your spring kit as you drive your car. Number one, always check your ride height over the first 100 to 200 miles. Our springs are warranted for life, but they will take a set one time. Once they do, readjust your ride height, and they will keep that ride height for the lifetime of the spring. Another thing to consider are the accessories that you add to your car. As you put more items on your car or even remove some of the accessories, double check your ride height to maintain the proper numbers that we give you in this installation. If you like the ride improvement that these springs give you, then you have much more available on the inside of the shock. Set up a time to have us do all of the internal valving and bypass tube modifications to get the most ride quality out of your car possible. If you have any questions about any of these products or other products that we offer, give us a call at 623-217-4959 or go to our website, shocktherapist.com.